Hey everyone, and welcome to the show. You know how sometimes you hear about these events in history that just totally explode onto the scene, like a sudden massive earthquake?
Mhm.
But when you really dig in, you realize there was this long, slow buildup, all these pressures and cracks forming beneath the surface before it all finally
Well,
erupts.
absolutely. It's like, for most people, the American Revolution is just boom, Declaration of Independence, Revolutionary War, America wins.
Right. But it's way more complicated than that. And the fallout from that eruption went so much further than just North America.
Exactly. I mean, you've got to think about the ripple effects across the entire world. And that's what's so fascinating about John Ferling's book, Shots Heard Around the World. It's this amazing deep dive into how the American Revolution truly was a global event.
Okay, so Shots Heard Around the World by John Ferling. This is the book that we're diving into today. And it's, like you said, it really explodes this myth that the revolution was just this isolated little skirmish in the colonies.
Yeah. It shows how deeply intertwined it was with all these other events happening in Europe, in the Caribbean, even Asia.
Right. And when I was starting this book, I was a little worried it might be dry or too academic. But Ferling does such a fantastic job of balancing the military stuff, the politics, and the social side of things.
Oh, I totally agree. He manages to weave together all those threads in a way that's actually gripping. You get caught up in the stories of the people involved, the strategies, the betrayals. It's all there.
And for me, one of the things that really stood out was how he digs into the decisions made by the leaders on all sides. You really get a sense of their motivations, their calculations, and sometimes even their mistakes.
Yes. And those mistakes, sometimes they had these huge consequences that really changed the course of the war for everyone.
Okay, so we both really loved this book, but I think it's only fair to mention a couple of things that maybe weren't quite perfect, just to give our listeners a balanced view.
Okay, sure.
I mean, the scope of this book is vast, right? And sometimes, with so much going on in so many different places, it felt like maybe some of the specific events could have been fleshed out a little more.
Yeah, I get what you mean. It's like trying to fit the entire universe into a single book, right?
Yeah.
You're going to have to simplify some things.
Exactly. And honestly, keeping track of all the different people involved, especially at the beginning, could be a bit of a challenge.
True, there are a lot of players on the stage, but I do think Furling does a pretty good job of giving you those key players, the ones you really need to follow.
Oh, for sure. And I think the last thing, and this is just something to keep in mind for anyone picking up this book, it really challenges that very American-centric view of the revolution.
Right, it's not just about the 13 colonies and their fight for independence. It's a much bigger picture.
Exactly. But even with those minor points, I'd still give this book a solid 4.5 out of 5 stars.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
It's a must-read for anyone who really wants to understand the American Revolution and its impact on the world.
Okay, so let's dive into some of the key insights from the book. Furling doesn't just drop you right into the middle of the war, with the fighting and everything.
Right? He takes you back, way back, to show you how those revolutionary flames were kind of smoldering for years before they burst into open rebellion.
And you see how it wasn't just a simple case of evil Britain versus the righteous colonists. It was much more nuanced than that.
Oh, yeah. It was a whole tangle of political blunders, miscalculations, and these growing tensions on both sides of the Atlantic. It's really fascinating.
So take the British government, for example. You might think they were always laser focused on these American colonies, ready to crush any sign of dissent. But that wasn't really the case at first, was it?
No, no, not at all. I mean, under Prime Minister Lord North, they were much more concerned with stability, with the economy. They were still dealing with the aftermath of the 7 Years' War.
Wow.
And honestly, they just didn't see the American colonies as that big of a deal. Not yet, anyway.
And North himself kind of hoped that, well, maybe this whole imperial dilemma, as he called it, would just sort of work itself out peacefully down the line.
Yeah. He even said something like, let's leave it to future generations to figure it out. Kick the can down the road.
But of course that didn't happen. Things started to escalate pretty quickly, especially after the Boston Tea Party in 1773.
Oh, yeah. That was a major turning point. When the colonists just went and dumped all that tea into the harbor, it sent shockwaves through the British government. This wasn't just some minor protest anymore. This was a direct challenge to their authority.
And then you have the First Continental Congress in 1774. You've got all these delegates from the colonies coming together trying to figure out what to do. And what's so interesting is how divided they were.
Oh, totally. Some of them were still really hesitant about this whole idea of breaking away from Britons. They were afraid of war, and they still hoped for some kind of reconciliation.
And some of them were even appealing to the, quote, aid and assistance and protection of the arms of our mother country. I mean, that's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah. But then you have figures like George Washington who are starting to say, hey, wait a minute, we can't just back down every time the British try to push us around. We have to stand up for our rights and liberties.
So they end up taking this kind of cautious approach, agreeing to boycott British goods, but not yet ready to fully commit to a war for independence.
And meanwhile, back in England, the Earl of Dartmouth, he's the guy in charge of the colonies,
Uh-huh.
he's starting to think, okay, maybe we need to get ready for a fight. But even then, they totally underestimated the Americans. They called them and I'm quoting here, rude rabble without a plan.
Oh, wow. Big mistake.
Huge mistake. And General Gage, the guy in charge of Boston, he was actually hoping the Americans would fire the first shot. He wanted to make them look like the aggressors, you know?
Ah, so he could say, look, they started it.
Exactly. And of course, that's pretty much what happened at Lexington and Concord in 1775. Those early battles, they kind of get romanticized later on, but at the time, they were a massive shock to everyone.
Right. It was like, okay, this is really happening now. There's no going back. And when news of those British losses reached London, well, the British government finally realized that this was no longer some little local disturbance.
Yeah. And it was Lord North himself who finally admitted that the conflict, quote, must be treated as a foreign war. I mean, you can almost imagine him saying that with this, like, sinking feeling in his stomach.
Yeah, like, oh no, what have we gotten ourselves into?
Exactly. And their initial strategy, well, it was a mess. They were slow to react, they underestimated the Americans, and their communication was terrible. They did eventually send over General Howe to replace Gage, but it took them ages to actually get their forces organized.
And meanwhile, you've got George Washington. He's just been appointed commander of the Continental Army, and he knows he's facing a monumental task. He even compared it to setting sail on a, quote, tempestuous ocean with no safe harbor.
And you got to remember, the Continental Army, at this point, it's not exactly a well-oiled machine, right?
Oh, far from it. They were constantly short on men, supplies, everything. Washington was relying on these short-term militia enlistments, and public support was already starting to waver after that initial burst of enthusiasm in 1775.
Yeah. It's amazing how he managed to hold everything together in those early months.
Yeah.
He even admitted later that if he had known how hard it was going to be, he might never have taken the job.
And then there's the invasion of Canada in 1775, 1776, which, well, let's just say it didn't go as planned.
Yeah, that was a tough one. They had some initial successes, but then the brutal Canadian winter, disease, and the British reinforcements, it all just became too much. It was a disaster.
But even though it was a military defeat, it kind of pushed more colonists towards the idea of independence. They realized that they couldn't rely on the British anymore and that maybe going it alone was their only option.
And it's around this time that the Continental Congress starts to get serious about seeking help from foreign powers. They send Silas Deane over to France to try and get some support, especially weapons and supplies.
And this is where things get really interesting on the international stage. France, they just lost the 7 Years' War to Britain, and they were looking for any opportunity to get back at their old rival.
Right, and they saw the American Revolution as this perfect chance to weaken Britain. They'd been rebuilding their navy under the Duc de Choiseul, specifically with this goal in mind.
So they were kind of ready for a fight. And then you have Vergennes, the French foreign minister. He's this shrewd diplomat who's weighing all the risks and benefits of supporting the Americans.
Yeah. He's getting all these reports from his agents, some of them a little too optimistic about the American chances, but they're all pointing to the same thing. Britain might actually lose this thing.
And then you've got figures like Beaumarchais who are seeing this as a chance to make some money and help France at the same time. They start funneling supplies and resources to the colonists, kind of under the table at first.
There's like this whole secret operation going on. And meanwhile, the British, they're still stubbornly convinced that they can win this war. They keep underestimating the Americans, even after some pretty big setbacks.
And you've got figures like Lord Germain, who's in charge of the war effort back in London, just completely dismissing the American military. It's almost like they couldn't believe that these colonists could actually pose a serious threat.
But everything changes with the American victory at Saratoga in 1777. This was the turning point that Vergennes had been waiting for. It showed him that the Americans could actually win. And it finally convinced him to officially throw France's support behind them.
And that's when they signed the Treaty of Alliance in 1778. It was a huge deal for the Americans. They finally had a powerful ally with a strong navy, and it completely changed the balance of power in the war.
But even with France on their side, things weren't easy for the Americans. The French Admiral d'Estaing, his campaign in North America didn't really achieve what they hoped for, and he ended up sailing off to the West Indies, where France had its own colonial interests to protect.
Right. And that's when the focus of the war shifts to the South. The British thought they could exploit the loyalist sentiment there and kind of turn the tide of the war.
Yeah, it was called the Southern Strategy. But they ran into some serious resistance. The American patriots in the South, they weren't going down without a fight.
And the fighting in the South was brutal. You had these partisan groups, loyalists versus patriot, just tearing each other apart. And then you have Native American tribes getting involved on both sides, which just adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing.
And don't forget about the conditions the soldiers were fighting in. I mean, disease was a bigger killer than bullets. Both sides were suffering from shortages, inadequate medical care, and just the sheer hardship of campaigning in those conditions.
And we often forget about the role of the state militias. These were ordinary citizens who were called up to fight, and they were crucial in supporting the Continental Army, especially at key moments like Saratoga.
But they were also notoriously unreliable. They would only serve for short periods, and it was a constant headache for Washington trying to keep them supplied and organized.
And, it's interesting to think about the motivations of the soldiers on both sides. It wasn't always about some grand ideology or national loyalty. For a lot of them, it was about economic necessity, maybe a sense of adventure, or even just the pressure to conform.
Yeah. And both armies had a surprising number of women and civilians who followed them, providing all sorts of essential services. It wasn't just about the men on the battlefield.
And then you have the Hessians, these German mercenaries hired by the British. They added this whole other dimension to the war. And some of them, after seeing how relatively well-off people were in America, they actually ended up deserting and staying in the colonies.
Wow, that's a fascinating detail. And, as the war dragged on, the financial strain on both sides was just immense. Britain's national debt doubled, taxes went through the roof, and there was growing pressure back home to just end the war no matter what.
And in America, well, the revolution was already having a huge impact on society and politics. The ideas of liberty and equality were spreading, and there were calls for greater democracy and voting rights.
Right, and you see the issue of slavery starting to come to the forefront. Enslaved people were seeing this as an opportunity to escape to freedom, often seeking refuge with the British. It's this incredibly complex and tragic side of the revolution that we often don't hear about.
So you've got all these military campaigns, diplomatic maneuvering, betrayals, alliances shifting. It's a whole whirlwind of events. And then you have the defection of Benedict Arnold in 1780, which was a huge blow to the American cause.
Oh yeah, that was a major turning point, not in a good way for the Americans. But even with those setbacks, they managed to hold on. And ultimately, it was that alliance with France that proved to be the decisive factor.
Right. The combined Franco-American forces, with the help of the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse, they finally managed to trap Cornwallis at Yorktown in 1781. And that victory, it was a huge turning point. It basically broke the British will to fight.
Yeah, I mean, they'd already spent a ton of money, lost a lot of men, and public opinion back home was turning against the war. They were ready for it to be over.
So the peace negotiations begin in Paris, and it's a whole other story of intrigue and diplomacy. You've got figures like Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay. They're playing this delicate game, trying to get the best deal for America while also managing their relationship with France.
And one of the most fascinating things is how John Jay decides to go behind France's back and negotiate directly with Britain. It was a risky move, but it ended up working brilliantly.
Yeah. He managed to secure these incredibly favorable terms for America in the Treaty of Paris, which was signed in 1783. They got their independence, a huge amount of territory, and even fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland. It was a remarkable achievement.
And the impact of the American Revolution went way beyond just the creation of a new nation. It inspired revolutions and reform movements all over the world, especially in France.
So what does all this mean for us today? I think the biggest takeaway is that the American Revolution wasn't just some isolated event in the 18th century. It was this global turning point that helped to shape the modern world.
Exactly. And by understanding that broader context, we can get a much deeper appreciation for how interconnected our world really is, and how events that might seem far removed from our own lives can have these huge, lasting consequences.
So if this deep dive into the global story of the American Revolution has sparked your interest, well, first of all, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history.
And don't forget to check out John Ferling's Shots Heard Round the World. We've got a link to it down in the description.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts. What surprised you the most about this story? What was your biggest takeaway? Let us know in the comments below.
And please share this video with anyone who might be interested. Let's get more people talking about history and how it shapes our world.
Thanks so much for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time.